In this Comics and Lit guide to language analysis, I'm going to introduce you to an essential set of language techniques, which are a great baseline for analysing any text in English. Each technique will be accompanied by a literary example to show you how they create effects in context. Language techniques, also referred to as language methods or devices, essentially focus on the types of words, phrases, and specific choices a writer makes in order to create a mood or feeling in the reader. For GCSE and other qualifications, students are expected to analyse texts by selecting evidence and explaining how these techniques are being used to impact the reader. So don't forget, naming a technique is just the first step. Explaining the effect is the real skill. There are actually hundreds of different techniques a writer can employ, but I'm going to focus on a small set of techniques which are really common in many texts. These will do the job for most students at GCSE. To help you remember them, I've created a simple acronym, M.A.T.E.R.I.A.L.S, which will help you to memorise them more easily. I'll take you through each technique with a simple definition and an example. M is for mood. Mood is simply the emotional response that the writer wants to create in the reader. Mood is created by specific words or other methods. It's a great one to use alongside analysis of key words, as you can use mood analysis to quickly explore the effect on the reader. Take a look at this example from the opening of 1984 by George Orwell. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. We might describe the mood of this sentence as unsettling or confusing. This is specifically created by the detail of the clock striking 13, which jolts the reader because clocks should only strike 1 to 12. A is for adjectives and adverbs. These are two specific word classes in English. Adjectives are words which describe nouns. They are usually found before or after the object or thing they are describing. For example, look at the sentence, "There was a house." This sentence has no adjectives, so the reader cannot really imagine the type, size, style, condition of the house. That's what adjectives do. They tell us what kind. I could add adjectives before the noun like this, the dreary, crumbling house. The adjectives dreary and crumbling tell us this house is in a poor condition. The word order could be changed and the adjectives could follow the noun, like this. The house was dreary and crumbling. Adverbs are words which modify or add information to verbs or adjectives in a sentence. They are often easy to spot as many end in ly. Consider this simple sentence. Tom ran across the park. Without an adverb, we don't know how Tom is running. I could add rapidly to tell you Tom is in a rush, or elegantly to show you there's something skilled or beautiful about his running style. So as you can see, both adjectives and adverbs work to create mood in a text by giving additional information to the reader. T is for tone. Tone, like mood, refers to emotions created by language, but tone focuses on the apparent attitude of the writer to the things they are describing. So if mood is the feeling created in the reader, tone is the feeling of the writer. If a character speaks in a text, you can explain what emotion they are feeling also. Take a look at this section of speech from Arthur Burling in J.B. Priestley's An Inspector Calls. "I'm talking as a hard-headed, practical man of business." The adjectives hard-headed and practical suggest Arthur is bragging by complimenting himself. We could analyse his tone as self-satisfied or pompous here. To illustrate the difference between mood and tone, the audience's mood here could be distrustful or disapproving, since nobody likes a show-off. So the tone of a writer or character can affect the mood of a text, but be different. E is for exaggeration. The fancier term for this is hyperbole, but the two words mean the same thing. Writers often use hyperbole to exaggerate the attributes of something or a character's emotions. This creates a bigger impact on the reader. Here's a classic example of hyperbole from Shakespeare's Macbeth. After murdering the king, Macbeth asks, "Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood from my hand?" By stating that there isn't enough water in the ocean to clean his hands of the king's blood, it heightens the sense of guilt and remorse Macbeth is feeling and intensifies the drama in the scene. R is for repetition. An easy one to analyse. When analysing language, look for any words or phrases that are directly repeated. This is usually done deliberately by a writer to emphasise or intensify a certain idea or feeling. Here's a classic example of word repetition from an Inspector Calls. When offering his final words to the Burling family, the inspector claims, "But there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths left with us." Here the repetition creates a forceful tone and intensifies the seriousness of the inspector's message about responsibility. I is for imagery. So I'm cheating a bit here because imagery is a general term for any technique which helps the reader to form vivid mental pictures of something in the text. Imagery includes the following specific features: simile, metaphor, personification, zoomorphism, sensory language such as sight, sounds, smells, taste or touch, and even details like colour. You can use imagery as a catch-all word, again if you're not sure of a specific technique. I'd advise you to pair it with an adjective though, such as violent imagery or romantic imagery, which will show greater understanding. For example, look at this quote describing the crash site in the jungle from William Golding's Lord of the Flies. "All round him the long scar smashed into the jungle was a bath of heat." Consider the feeling created by the words scar and smashed. Both relate to violence, so we could analyse the use of violent imagery, which makes the reader anxious of possible threat or danger. Now let's look at some more specific categories of imagery. First, the metaphor. Metaphor is everywhere in writing. In simple terms, a metaphor is where one thing is said to be something else. It's a comparison which is not meant to be taken literally. Consider a sports commentator saying a player is on fire. We know the player is not literally on fire. What they really mean is they are playing extremely well. That's what metaphors do. Use an expressive comparison to make a more powerful statement. If we look at the previous example again, all round him the long scar smashed into the jungle was a bath of heat. Can you see the metaphor? Golding describes the temperature as a bath of heat. We think, well, there's not literally a bath there, so what does the writer mean? Bathing means to be surrounded with water, so it means they are surrounded by heat. So here the metaphor expresses the intensity and pervasiveness of the heat in the jungle. Next, let's look at the simile. Like the metaphor, a simile compares one thing to another, but this time using like or as to connect the comparison. Look at this example from Romeo and Juliet. Romeo states, "Is love a tender thing? It is too rough, too rude, too boisterous, and it pricks like thorn." The statement that love pricks like thorn is a simile, which has the effect of making love sound sharp and painful. The comparison to a thorn on a rose bush creates an idea of pain and beauty, which speaks to a deeper truth about love. Here's another example of a simile, this time using as instead of like. In his poem Daffodils, poet William Wordsworth wrote, "I wandered lonely as a cloud," comparing his lonely walk to a cloud's path across the sky. This simile creates a sense of lightness and romance to the opening line of the poem, encouraging us to drift away into a calm state of mind. Our next specific type of imagery is personification. Here the clue is in the name. Writers use personification to give an inhuman object human-like qualities. Look at the example from Blake's poem The Sick Rose. "O rose, thou art sick." The word sick is not usually applied to plants. Therefore, Blake is personifying the rose in order to create sympathy in the reader. Similar to personification is zoomorphism. Again, there's a clue in the name itself. The word zoo refers to animals, so a zoomorphism is where animal qualities are given to non-animal things. A classic example is John Steinbeck's description of the character Lenny in Of Mice and Men. When he is under attack, Lenny covered his face with his huge paws and bleated with terror. The use of paws creates perhaps imagery of a bear, while bleats equates with a sheep. The zoomorphic description suggests both Lenny's size and power, but also his innocence. Additionally, within the umbrella of imagery, you can also analyse descriptions which focus on the senses. You can simply use the term sensory imagery to refer to descriptions focusing on any of the 5 senses. If you want to go into precise detail, visual imagery relates to things which are seen. Auditory imagery describes things which are heard. Tactile imagery describes how things feel when touched. Gustatory imagery refers to descriptions focusing on taste, and olfactory imagery describes smell. Look at the following extract from Dracula by Bram Stoker, where solicitor Jonathan Harker is travelling by carriage to Dracula's estate. How many types of imagery can you see? Soon we were hemmed in with trees, which in places arched right over the roadway till we passed as through a tunnel. And again great frowning rocks guarded us boldly on either side. Though we were in shelter, we could hear the rising wind, for it moaned and whistled through the rocks, and the branches of the trees crashed together as we swept along. It grew colder and colder still, and fine powdery snow began to fall, so that soon we and all around us were covered with a white blanket. Did you identify the visual imagery in details like hemmed in with trees and white blanket, auditory imagery in moaned and whistled, and tactile imagery in colder and colder? This is a great example of how writers deploy sensory imagery to create a vivid description of setting. A is for alliteration. Alliteration refers to the repetition of the first letter or sound at the beginning of several closely connected words. Like imagery, there are several common types of alliteration which create differing effects. Here are some common types. Sibilant alliteration is the repetition of the S sound. It tends to create a hissing sound, so is often associated with threat or danger. For example, in Macbeth, the phrase supernatural soliciting uses sibilant alliteration to hint at the danger posed by the witches. Another common form is fricative alliteration, which is the repetition of the F sound. This is used in Wilfred Owen's war poem Exposure, in pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. Here the fricatives mimic the shivering of the soldiers from the icy conditions. Plosive alliteration refers to the repetition of the P or B sound. This can sound bold or even aggressive. Near the end of his poem about a ruined statue, Percy Shelley writes, "Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare." And the plosive alliteration of boundless and bare creates a sense of power relating to the desert, which draws the focus from the once mighty statue. Next up is dental alliteration, which is the repetition of the D or T sound. A great example in Macbeth is the witch's spell, where the dental double, double, toil and trouble highlights the aggressive nature of the witch's spell. The last form of alliteration to consider is guttural alliteration, which employs the repetition of the G sound. Wilfred Owen uses this to powerful effect in his poem Disabled, where the injured soldier is described shivering in his ghastly suit of grey. Here the effect is perhaps to emphasise the pain and pent-up frustration of the soldier whose life has been changed by his injuries. L is for listing. This is another particularly handy one for analysis. Writers will often list words, descriptions or actions in order to emphasise the attributes of something. Just keep an eye out for a run of commas and you'll notice a list. A good example is from Gerald Durrell's description of the family garden in My Family and Other Animals. Beds in the shape of stars, half-moons, triangles and circles. Here it seems to create a feeling of breathless excitement. And finally, the last technique to consider in my essential list. S is for semantic field. This sounds complicated, but is actually very straightforward. A semantic field simply refers to words in a section of a text whose meanings are closely related. So for example, the words red, kiss, heart and Valentine create a semantic field of love, since they all closely link to that idea. A great example of semantic field can be found in Lady Macbeth's soliloquy from Act 1 of Macbeth. The raven himself is hoarse that croaks the fatal entrance of Duncan under my battlements. Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here and fill me from the crown to the toe, top full of direst cruelty. Perhaps you've already spotted it. The most obvious connection between many of the words is death. Words like raven, which is a symbol of bad omens or death, horse, relating to sickness, fatal, spirits, which relates to ghosts, mortal, meaning a person who can die, direst, which means the worst, and cruelty. Each of these words helps to create a semantic field of death, which helps to illustrate the character's murderous intentions to the audience. So to identify a semantic field, just look for perhaps 3 or more words in close proximity that seem connected in tone or effect. Then think, how could these be linked? If there's a clear connection, you have a semantic field. Well, that covers this set of essential techniques which you can use to analyse any text if you're studying literature or language. And don't forget the acronym MATERIALS is a useful memory cue to help you if you're preparing for an exam or final coursework. Thanks for watching.